now that we have our prefabs set up, we can drag and drop them here in our scene. So now we have our circle, and I'm going to set it at 0, 0 and reposition it above a little bit. And also I'm going to drag our needle, which is also going to be at 0, 0 for the start, but I'm going to reposition it something like this. We are going to resize our circle in the game, so we see that its scale on the X and on the Y, it's at 0.8.8. And if you resize it like this, well, on the scale, you see that its size changes. And you can, well, set this up yourself however difficult your game, or however you want the game to be difficult. You can resize the circle to be smaller or bigger. But now we are going to program our game. And here I have created our scripts folder, and inside of it we have our needle scripts folder. And inside of that folder I have created this needle movement script, which is going to allow us to fire our needle. So simply double click it so MonoDevelop will open it. Now here we need a couple of variables. First I'm going to create a serialized field, and this is going to be a private game object, and this is going to be our needle body. Now what is this serialized field? Well, if we go back now, and if I attach the component on the needle script, the needle script on my needle game object, here we can hit apply. We see that we have this needle body here in the inspector panel, and we can, for example, drag and drop our needle body here as a reference. And we are done. So now we have this reference in our script here, and we can manipulate it. But if I remove this serialized field, and because I set my, well, variable here to be private, if I go back in the Unity editor, we see, or this needle head, which we had previously, has disappeared. So we don't have that reference. Because there are a couple of ways that we can get components or game objects from our script. One is this, or using this serialized field. That is if we set our game object to be private. If we set it to be public like this, we can go here and again we can have it. So we see it right here. But a general rule, it's better to have private variables, and I talk about that in my other course, so you can check that out. And the better rule, as I said, is to have private variables and then use this serialized field in order to get our components. So again, we can see that we have it here. We can hit apply, but make sure that you drag and drop our needle body. So again, needle body, don't drag the needle head. And now we can go back here. The next variable that we need is a private Boolean variable, and we can name it can shoot circle. And again, we need a private bool variable, and this is going to be touched the circle. We also need a private float variable, and this is going to be speed or the power, however you want it. So let's say we added at 70. And the last variable that we need, and here I'm going to say private rigid body 2D, and I'm going to name it my body. So here we can create our awake function. Here we are going to get our components and initialize our game. This is the first function that's going to be called after our script or after we run our game. So we also have the start function. So here we have void start function, and we have these functions because we inherit from MonoBehavior, and these functions are declared in MonoBehavior. So first, when we start our game, so if we go back here and click here play, this is the first function that's going to be called the awake function. On here we can initialize our variable. So here, for example, if we want to change the speed, we can say, for example, speed is equal to 100 here, and when we run the game, this is going to be the value of our speed variable. And well, after our awake function is called, then we are going to call our start function. But at the moment we don't need our start function. Instead, I'm going to create here an initialize, so initialize function, and here we are going to initialize our, well, script. First, I'm going to use our needle body, so I'm going to say needle body dot set active to be equal to false. What this is going to do is this is going to deactivate our game object. So now we are here in the scene or in the game view. Notice now if I take my game body, and here in the inspector panel, the needle body. And here in the inspector panel, near this cube here, I have this checkbox. If I uncheck it, we don't see the needle body in the, game anymore. If I check it again, we see it. Well, practically, if we set it to be, active and pass here false, we are going to deactivate it, so it's not going to be visible here in the game. And if we set it to be equal to true, it's going to be visible again. So here in the initialize function, we are going to do that. So deactivate our needle body, and we are going to use my body, which is going to be equal to get component. And this is another way to get the component. So if we go here on our needle, we have this rigid body attached. So we see it right here. And we need this rigid body in order to apply force to our needle. But we did not set it to be public or serialized field so that we can drag and drop it here in our script. Instead, I'm going to use this get component, and here I'm going to pass the rigid body 2D, and this is how I'm going to get a reference to that rigid body. If I were to set this serialized field on my rigid body like this and go back, here we have that rigid body. And if you wanted to add it like this, you can simply drag and drop the whole game object here, because this game object has a rigid body, and you can drag and drop needle, the whole game object right here, and this is going to accept it as a rigid body, and we can use that rigid body in our, script. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to, set it to be private, and after that, use this initialize function, which by the way, we need to call here in the awake function. And here I'm going to get the component for my rigid body. So make sure you do that, and make sure that you call this function here in the awake function. Next, we are going to create the update function. So here I'm going to create the update function, and this function is called each frame. So what we put here will be executed each frame. And here what we are going to do, and I'm simply going to change this from can shoot to can fire circle, or here we need to pass the needle, so not circle, so excuse me for that. So can fire needle. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if can fire needle, so if we can fire our needle, I'm going to use my body dot velocity, it's going to be equal to new vector 2, and here I'm going to say 0, and here I'm going to pass the speed for my y-axis. So this is the x-axis, this is the y-axis. This will determine where we are adding velocity. So I'm simply going to add velocity on the y-axis. And to make this more understandable, I'm going to name this one force y. I'm going to name this variable and simply pass here instead of speed, pass force y. So we are using the velocity from our rigid body to move our game object up. So don't apply a force at the x-axis. X-axis will be 0. And again, simply type my body dot velocity. So we are accessing the rigid body, which by the way simulates physics in Unity Engine. So we are accessing its velocity and adding velocity on the y, and this is going to move our game object. And here I'm going to create a public void function, can fire the needle, like this. Or we can simply say fire the needle. So name it fire the needle, and here we are going to initialize, or we are going to enable our needle to be fired. So first we need to use our needle body set active to be equal to true, because we set it here to be deactivated and calling this in the awake function. Next, what we need to do is here I need to say my body dot is kinematic is equal to false. And here can fire needle is equal to true. So this is the Boolean variable that's going to enable us to fire the needle. Here we are checking if that variable is true. So if this variable is true, we are going to fire the needle. But initially it's equal to false. By default, if we don't add a value to a Boolean variable here, it's equal to false. So this right here is the same. So if we don't add a value, if we don't type it's equal to false, it's the same if we simply declare it, So initially it's equal to false. Here we are setting to be equal to true, and now we can fire our needle. Now what this is kinematic means? Well, if I go back here And notice now what I'm going to do. I have my needle. And since we added rigid body, as I said, rigid body simulates physics. And since I added rigid body to it, if I run the game now, my needle is going to fall down as we just saw. So let me position it right here so that we can see it falling. So we see it that it's falling right away now. So what is the problem? Well, practically, as I said, the rigid body is applying physics to it. So we have the mass, we have the linear drag, we have the gravity, so on and so forth. But if I set it to be is kinematic, if I check this checkbox, and now if I run it, we will see it standing, meaning the physics is not affecting it. If I uncheck this is kinematic, it's going to fall. And that's why we are setting it to be kinematic by default. So click here is kinematic and hit apply. So now what we can do, we can test this out. I can click here or copy this fire the needle, and I'm going to, well, set it here or call it in the awake function. We are going to call this function from other function in order to fire the needle, but I just want you to see or to demonstrate that we can actually fire our needle. So now if I go back, if I run the game, we are going to see that our needle is, well, being fired, but it's fired by such a speed that we don't see it. So at the moment, we are not going to do anything else. We are going to stop here, and in the next video we are going to tweak the settings in order to fire our needle more smoothly and in order to detect collision with our circle. So let's go in the next video and see how can we do that.